The morning mist hung thick over the French countryside on June 1st, 1918, as Captain Daniel Daly of the United States Marine Corps 2nd Battalion peered through his field glasses at the dense woodland ahead. Belleau woods stretched before him like a dark green fortress, its ancient oaks and undergrowth concealing an enemy that had already proven its deadly efficiency across the battlefields of Europe. The German spring offensive, launched just months earlier, had pushed Allied forces to the breaking point, and now American forces found themselves standing as the final bulwark against Kaiser Wilhelm II's war machine. The woods themselves seemed to whisper of impending doom. Local French farmers had fled weeks ago, leaving behind empty farmhouses and abandoned fields that now served as staging areas for what would become one of the most brutal engagements in American military history. The German Fourth Army had dug in deep within the forest, creating a labyrinth of machine gun nests, trenches, and fortified positions that turned every tree trunk into potential cover and every clearing into a killing field. Marine Private First. Class. Johnny Thompson crouched beside his Lewis gun, checking and rechecking the ammunition belts with the nervous precision of a man who understood that his next few hours might be his last. Around him, the men of the 5th Marine Regiment prepared, their equipment with the grim determination that had become their trademark. These were not the green recruits who had shipped out from Paris Island months earlier. They were seasoned fighters who had already tasted the bitter reality of trench warfare. Colonel James Harbord, commanding the 2nd Brigade, had made his intentions crystal clear during the pre-dawn briefing. The German positions in Belleau Wood represented a critical threat to the Allied line. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were using the forest as a staging area for attacks on the vital Paris-Metz road, and if they succeeded in breaking through, the path to the French capital would lie wide open. The Marines had been tasked with what seemed an impossible mission: assault and capture a fortified position held by battle-hardened German troops who had spent weeks preparing their defenses. According to historical accounts documented in the Marine Corps archives, the initial reconnaissance reports painted a sobering picture of the challenges ahead. The sound of artillery shells whistling overhead broke the morning silence, signaling the beginning of the preliminary bombardment. For 30 minutes, Allied guns pounded the German positions, sending geysers of earth and splintered wood skyward as high-explosive shells tore through the forest canopy. Yet even as the barrage continued, veteran Marines knew that artillery alone would not dislodge an entrenched enemy from such ideal defensive terrain. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Wise gathered his battalion commanders around a hastily drawn map spread across an ammunition crate. His weathered face bore the marks of months of combat, and his eyes reflected the weight of responsibility for the lives of over 800 Marines under his command. The plan was deceptively simple in concept, but would prove devastatingly complex in execution. Advance across nearly 400 yards of open ground, penetrate the German defensive perimeter, and fight through dense woodland to secure the entire forest. As the artillery barrage lifted and an eerie silence settled over the battlefield, Captain Daly turned to face his men. His voice carried the authority of a leader who had earned his stripes through countless battles, from the Philippines to the Caribbean. The Marines checked their rifles one final time, adjusted their packs, and prepared to write their names in blood across the pages of military history. The whistle's shrill cry pierced the morning air at exactly 0500 hours on June 6th. 1918, as Marines of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Regiment rose from their jumping-off positions and began their advance across the wheat field toward Belleau Wood. What followed would become etched in Marine Corps legend as one of the most ferocious small unit actions in American military history. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Daly, already a holder of 2 Medals of Honor, embodied the fighting spirit that would define this engagement. As German machine guns opened fire from concealed positions within the tree line, cutting down Marines in the first wave, Daly stood exposed in the killing field and delivered words that would resonate through military history. "Come on, you sons of bitches! Do you want to live forever?" His rallying cry galvanized the attacking Marines, who surged forward despite the withering fire that turned the peaceful French countryside into a charnel house. The German defenders, primarily elements of the 4th Marine Division under the command of experienced officers who had survived years of brutal fighting on the Western Front, had transformed Belleau Wood into a fortress of interlocking fields of fire. Every boulder, fallen log, and depression in the ground concealed machine, gun positions, or sniper nests. The dense undergrowth that had once provided shelter for deer and wild boar now offered concealment to enemy soldiers armed with the latest in killing technology. Private Thompson's Lewis gun team advanced by bounds, with Marines providing covering fire while others moved forward in short rushes. The forest floor, carpeted with decades of fallen leaves, became slick with blood as casualties mounted on both sides. German Maxim machine guns, firing at a rate of 600 rounds per minute, created a deadly crossfire that channeled the American advance into predetermined killing zones. Captain Peter Conti's company encountered their first major resistance at a rocky outcropping that the Germans had fortified with sandbags and barbed wire. The position commanded a clear field of fire across a natural clearing, and any attempt to advance directly would result in certain death. Conti, a veteran of the fighting at Chateau Thierry, understood that conventional tactics would prove suicidal in this environment. Military historians, as documented in the official records of the American Battle Monuments Commission, would later describe the German defensive strategy as a masterpiece of tactical engineering. The Marines adapted with the flexibility that would become their trademark. Small squads infiltrated through the dense underbrush, using every available piece of natural cover to approach the German positions from unexpected angles. Corporal James Smith led a flanking maneuver that took his fire team through a ravine filled with brambles and fallen timber, emerging behind the German machine gun nest just as the main force launched a frontal assault. The fighting devolved into a series of small unit actions, with individual Marines and German soldiers engaged in deadly games of cat and mouse among the trees. Bayonet charges became common as ammunition ran low and visibility dropped to mere yards in the thick forest. The crack of rifle fire mixed with the screams of wounded men and the splintering of wood as bullets found their marks. By midday, the Marines had penetrated the outer defensive perimeter, but at a terrible cost. Companies that had begun the attack with full strength were reduced to skeleton crews. Medical corpsmen worked frantically to evacuate the wounded, often under direct fire as German snipers targeted anyone who attempted to aid the fallen. The forest floor became littered with the detritus of modern warfare, empty cartridge cases, shredded equipment, and the bodies of brave men from both sides. Lieutenant William Eddy's platoon found themselves pinned down in a small depression, surrounded by German positions that seemed to materialize from the very trees themselves. With ammunition running dangerously low and casualties mounting, Eddy made the decision that would epitomize the Marine fighting spirit throughout the battle. Rather than retreat, he ordered his remaining Marines to fix bayonets and prepare for a final assault that would either break the German line or result in their own destruction. The third day of the Battle of Belleau Wood, June 8, 1918, dawned with the acrid smell of cordite and death hanging heavy in the forest air. Marine casualties had been staggering, but the fighting spirit of the Corps remained unbroken. German prisoners captured during the night raids spoke in hushed tones about the Teufelhunden, the devil dogs, whose ferocious attacks had shattered supposedly impregnable defensive positions. Major John Hughes Berry, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, had established his command post in a shell crater that offered minimal protection from the constant sniper fire. His maps, stained with mud and blood, showed a grim picture of the tactical situation. The Marines had secured several key positions within the wood, but German counterattacks had retaken much of the ground gained at such terrible cost. The forest had become a nightmarish maze where friend and foe often found themselves within arm's reach, separated only by a fallen log or cluster of trees. The German forces, commanded by seasoned officers who had survived the meat grinders of Verdun and the Somme, were no mere garrison troops. These were battle-hardened veterans of the 4th Marine Division and elements of the 28th Infantry Division, men who understood the tactical value of the terrain they defended. They had spent weeks fortifying their positions, creating a defensive network that maximized the natural advantages of the dense woodland. Sergeant Major John Quick, a veteran whose career spanned conflicts from the Spanish-American War to the present European catastrophe, moved through the Marine positions with the calm efficiency of a man who had seen warfare in all its forms. His presence alone steadied young Marines who were experiencing their first taste of sustained combat. Quick's weathered hands, steady despite the chaos surrounding him, helped redistribute ammunition and reorganize scattered squads into effective fighting units. The Germans launched their most determined counterattack at dawn, emerging from concealed. Positions like ghosts materialized from the morning mist. Led by Hauptmann Fritz Miller, a Prussian officer whose Iron Cross testified to his combat experience, the assault aimed to recapture Hill 242, a slight elevation that commanded views across much of the southern portion of the wood. Contemporary accounts preserved in the National Archives describe the intensity of this phase of fighting as unprecedented in American military experience. Private Thompson's machine gun position became the focal point of the German assault. His Lewis gun, served by a crew reduced from 6 men to 3 through casualties, maintained a steady rate of fire that helped anchor the Marine defensive line. When German infantry charged across a small clearing, Thompson traversed his weapon with methodical precision, cutting down attackers while enemy bullets sparked off the rocks around his position. The fighting took on an almost medieval character. As ammunition supplies dwindled and Marines resorted to rifle butts, bayonets, and entrenching tools to continue the battle. Corporal William Jackson found himself engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a German soldier among the roots of an ancient oak tree. Both men fighting with the desperate fury of those who understood that only one would walk away from the encounter. Captain Lloyd Williams, commanding the 51st Company, received orders to withdraw his battered unit from an exposed position. His response would become part of Marine Corps legend. "Retreat! Hell, we just got here!" Williams's defiance epitomized the Marine attitude that would ultimately decide the battle's outcome. Rather than withdrawing, his Marines dug in deeper and prepared to hold their ground regardless of the odds. The medical situation became increasingly desperate as corpsmen struggled to evacuate wounded Marines through forest paths that had become shooting galleries for German snipers. Hospital apprentice First Class John Kelly moved between wounded Marines with complete disregard for his own safety, providing medical treatment under direct enemy fire. His actions would earn him the Medal of Honor, but more importantly, they embodied the Marine Corps ethos that no man would be left behind. As darkness fell over Belleau Wood on the 8th day of June, the opposing forces settled into a deadly routine of patrol actions and sniper duels. The forest, once a peaceful refuge for wildlife, had become a vision of hell where survival measured in hours rather than days. Yet despite the casualties and the apparent impossibility of their mission, the Marines maintained their hold on the positions they had won through such terrible sacrifice. The stage was set for the climactic phase of a battle that would define the Marine Corps' reputation for the next century. June 10, 1918, marked the beginning of what Marine historians would later call the most sustained and brutal fighting in the Corps' young history. The morning broke with the distinctive whistle of German artillery shells, as enemy observers directed accurate fire onto Marine positions throughout Belleau Wood. The forest that had once provided concealment now became a trap, with tree bursts, sending deadly splinters in every direction and turning solid oak trunks into sources of additional shrapnel. Colonel James Harbord, commanding the 4th Marine Brigade, had received explicit orders from General John Pershing himself. Belleau, wood must be cleared of enemy forces regardless of cost. The strategic importance of the position had become clear as German forces used the forest as a staging area for attacks against the vital supply lines feeding the American Expeditionary Force. Failure here could jeopardize the entire American effort on the Western Front. The Marines had learned hard lessons during their first week in the wood. Frontal assaults against prepared positions resulted in prohibitive casualties without corresponding tactical gains. Instead, small unit tactics became the norm, with squads and fire teams infiltrating through the dense undergrowth to attack German positions from unexpected directions. This style of fighting demanded individual initiative and courage from every Marine, qualities that the Corps had cultivated since its founding. Captain Peter Conti's company had been reduced to fewer than 30 effective men, but their morale remained unshaken. These veterans had survived the initial assault and learned to read the forest like a deadly book. They could identify machine gun positions by the sound of their firing, distinguish between incoming and outgoing artillery by the whistle of shells, overhead, and move through the undergrowth with a stealth that would have impressed the woodland Indians who had once hunted in these very forests. The German defenders adapted their tactics as well. Oberst Heinrich von Schenk, commanding the German 4th Reserve Division's elements in the wood, recognized that his forces faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered on the Western Front. These American Marines fought with a tenacity that reminded veteran German officers of their own elite stormtroops, but with a reckless courage that seemed to defy rational tactical doctrine. War correspondence accounts, preserved in contemporary newspaper archives, described the fighting as resembling a medieval siege transported to the 20th century. Gunnery Sergeant Ernest Jansen led a reconnaissance patrol deep into German-held territory, seeking intelligence on enemy dispositions for the next phase of the American offensive. His 5-man team moved through the forest with the patience of hunters, taking nearly 4 hours to cover ground that could normally be traversed in 20 minutes. Every step required careful consideration, as German snipers had proven devastatingly effective at picking off unwary Marines. The patrol discovered a major German ammunition depot hidden in a natural depression surrounded by thick brambles. Jansen's team spent 2 hours placing improvised explosives fashioned from hand grenades and gun cotton salvaged from damaged artillery shells. The resulting explosion not only destroyed significant enemy supplies, but also created confusion that allowed a follow-up Marine assault to capture a key defensive position. Private First Class Louis Kukela embodied the individual heroism that characterized the Marine effort. When his squad became pinned down by machine gun fire from a concealed German position, Kukela single-handedly flanked the enemy emplacement, using a combination of rifle grenades and bayonet work to eliminate the threat. His actions allowed his unit to continue their advance and would earn him the Medal of Honor, though the citation could hardly capture the desperate courage required for such an action. The medical challenges facing Marine corpsmen had reached crisis proportions. Traditional evacuation routes had become impassable due to enemy fire, forcing medical personnel to devise increasingly creative solutions. Chief Pharmacist's mate, John Bradley, organized stretcher teams that moved wounded Marines through drainage, ditches, and ravines, often crawling on their bellies while German artillery rained down around them. By evening on June 10th, Marine forces controlled approximately 60% of Belleau Wood, but the cost had been staggering. Individual companies had been reduced to squad strength, and some platoons existed only on paper. Yet the Marine advance continued, driven by a combination of tactical necessity and institutional pride that refused to acknowledge the possibility of defeat. The Germans, recognizing the impossibility of holding their remaining positions indefinitely, began preparing for a fighting withdrawal to secondary defensive lines. However, Oberst von Schenk had underestimated the Marine determination to complete their mission regardless of casualties. The Americans had no intention of allowing their enemy to escape intact from the forest that had already consumed so many of their comrades. The morning of June 12, 1918, brought with it a profound silence that unnerved Marines who had grown accustomed to the constant rattle of machine gun fire and the crash of artillery shells. This unnatural quiet settled over Belleau Wood like a shroud, broken only by the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle or the rustle of movement through the underbrush. The Germans had withdrawn during the night hours, but their departure was far from a retreat. It was a tactical repositioning to even stronger defensive positions deeper within the forest. Major Maurice Shearer, now commanding what remained of the 3rd Battalion after casualties had decimated the officer ranks, studied the intelligence reports with growing concern. German forces had established a new defensive line anchored on a series of rocky outcroppings that dominated the northern sector of the wood. These positions offered commanding fields of fire across natural clearings and had been fortified with typical German thoroughness during the brief respite in fighting. The Marine assault force that prepared to resume offensive operations bore little resemblance to the unit that had first entered Belleau Wood 6 days earlier. Companies had been consolidated due to casualties, with survivors from multiple units fighting alongside men they had never met before the battle. Yet this amalgamation of battle-tested Marines possessed a cohesion forged in combat that no peacetime training could replicate. Sergeant John Kelly, whose earlier actions had already earned him battlefield recognition, volunteered to lead a reconnaissance patrol to determine the extent of German repositioning. His 6-man team included Marines from 3 different companies, united now by shared experience and mutual trust earned through days of sustained combat. They moved through the forest with the confidence of men who had learned to read every sight and sound of their deadly environment. The patrol discovered that German engineers had worked throughout the night to create an elaborate system of interconnected trenches and fighting positions. Unlike the hastily prepared defenses that had characterized the earlier fighting, these new fortifications showed evidence of careful planning and construction. Barbed wire barriers channeled potential attackers into predetermined killing zones, while carefully camouflaged machine gun nests provided overlapping fields of fire. Military analyses conducted by the Army War College, as documented in their official histories, would later cite this phase of the battle as a textbook example of adaptive defensive tactics. Captain Clifton Cates, whose company had suffered severe casualties but maintained its fighting effectiveness, received orders to spearhead the next assault. His remaining Marines, numbering fewer than 40 men, represented all that remained of a unit that had entered the battle with full strength just 1 week earlier. Yet these survivors possessed a combat experience that transformed them into an elite fighting force. The attack commenced at dawn on June 13th, with a brief artillery preparation that served more to announce American intentions than to inflict significant damage on the well-protected German positions. Marine infantry advanced through the forest, using infiltration tactics perfected during their earlier fighting, with small teams moving independently toward assigned objectives while maintaining coordination through prearranged signals. Private Thompson, now serving as acting squad leader after casualties had eliminated the original command structure, led his reduced fire team toward a German strongpoint that dominated a key intersection of forest trails. His Lewis gun, served by Marines who had learned their trade through bitter experience, provided suppressive fire that allowed other elements to maneuver into assault positions. The fighting that followed represented the culmination of everything the Marines had learned during their week in hell. Individual acts of heroism became so commonplace that they passed almost without notice. Corporal David Porter charged a German machine gun position single-handedly when his squad became pinned down, using hand grenades and rifle fire to eliminate the threat. His actions allowed the Marine advance to continue, though Porter himself paid for his courage with his life. The German defenders fought with the desperation of men who understood that this represented their final opportunity to hold their positions. Hauptmann Müller, commanding the German rear guard, had positioned his most experienced troops in the strongest defensive positions, creating a series of mutually supporting strong points that required elimination through individual assault. By midday, Marine forces had penetrated the German defensive perimeter at 3 separate points, but each breakthrough had cost precious lives and ammunition. The forest floor, already carpeted with the debris of modern warfare, received fresh additions as both sides paid the price for their determination to control this strategically vital piece of French countryside. As afternoon shadows lengthened, through the smoke-filled forest it became clear that the battle for Belleau Wood was approaching its climactic phase. The Marines had come too far and sacrificed too much to accept anything less than complete victory, while the German defenders understood that failure here would open a gap in their lines that could prove strategically decisive. The dawn of June 26, 1918, broke gray and overcast, as if the very heavens mourned the carnage that had transformed Belleau Wood into a monument to human courage and sacrifice. For 20 days, Marines had fought through every yard of the forest, turning what should have been a brief tactical engagement into an epic struggle that would define their corps for generations to come. The final German stronghold lay ahead, a series of interconnected trenches and bunkers that represented the last organized resistance in the wood. Brigadier General James Harbord, whose 4th Marine Brigade had written its name in blood across the French countryside, prepared his men for what he knew would be the decisive action. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces had concentrated their remaining strength in a defensive position that maximized the natural advantages of the terrain. Rocky outcroppings provided natural cover, while interlocking fields of fire created killing zones that would challenge even the most experienced assault troops. The Marines who prepared for this final assault bore little resemblance to the units that had first entered Belleau Wood 3 weeks earlier. Companies had been rebuilt multiple times as casualties mounted, creating amalgamated units where survivors from different battalions fought alongside men they had met only days before. Yet this forced integration had created a cohesion born of shared sacrifice that transformed these battle-tested Marines into an elite fighting force. Captain Clifton Cates, whose company had been reduced to fewer than 20 men but whose fighting spirit remained undiminished, received the mission to spearhead the final assault. His Marines, faces blackened with cordite and eyes reflecting the 1,000-yard stare of combat veterans, checked their weapons with the mechanical precision of men who had learned that survival depended on attention to the smallest details. The preliminary bombardment commenced at 0500 hours, with Allied artillery concentrating unprecedented firepower on the German positions. For 40 minutes, high explosive shells tore through the forest canopy, sending geysers of earth and splintered wood skyward as gunners attempted to neutralize the defensive positions. Yet veteran Marines knew that artillery alone could not dislodge determined defenders from well-prepared positions. Contemporary accounts from the Marine Corps Historical Division document this as the most concentrated artillery barrage in support of Marine operations to that date. When the barrage lifted, an eerie silence settled over the battlefield, broken only by the crackle of fires ignited by the bombardment and the moans of wounded men calling for medical attention. Then, from positions scattered throughout the wood, came the shrill whistle blasts that signaled the final Marine assault. Companies that existed only in name emerged from their concealed positions and began their advance toward the German lines. Private Thompson, now a seasoned combat veteran despite having entered the battle as a replacement, led his fire team forward, with the confidence of a man who had survived 3 weeks of sustained combat. His Lewis gun team moved by bounds, with Marines providing covering fire while others advanced through the smoke and debris created by the artillery bombardment. The forest floor, carpeted with shell fragments and fallen timber, made movement treacherous, but these Marines had learned to navigate such obstacles through bitter experience. The German defenders, commanded by officers who had survived years of combat on the Western Front, opened fire with the precise timing that characterized their military tradition. Machine guns that had survived the bombardment by virtue of deep bunkers and overhead protection swept the Marine advance with carefully planned fields of fire. Yet the Americans had learned to anticipate such defensive measures, and their advance continued despite the withering fire. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Daly, whose earlier exhortation to his Marines had become legendary, found himself leading a flanking attack against a German strong point that anchored the enemy's left flank. His small assault team, composed of Marines, drawn from multiple units, moved through a ravine that provided concealment from enemy observers. The approach required nearly an hour of careful movement through terrain that channeled their advance into a narrow corridor swept by machine gun fire. The climactic assault developed into a series of individual actions as Marines engaged German defenders in close combat among the shattered trees and shell craters. Corporal Earl Hoffman charged a German machine gun position that had decimated his squad, using rifle grenades and bayonet work to eliminate the threat. His sacrifice allowed the Marine advance to continue, though Hoffman himself fell within sight of the objective he had fought so hard to reach. By noon on June 26th, Marine forces had overrun the final German defensive positions. The few surviving German soldiers, recognizing the impossibility of further resistance, began surrendering to Marines who had proven their courage through 3 weeks of sustained combat. The Battle of Belleau Wood was over, but its legacy would endure as long as men remembered the price of freedom. The silence that settled over Belleau Wood in the afternoon hours of June 26, 1918, carried a weight that pressed upon every surviving Marine like a physical burden. After 26 days of sustained combat, the forest stood conquered, but the price of victory had been measured in the blood of America's finest young men. The trees that had witnessed centuries of peaceful seasons now bore the scars of modern warfare, their trunks splintered by shell fragments and their roots nourished by the sacrifice of heroes. Major General John Lejeune, commanding the 2nd Infantry Division, walked through the captured positions with the measured tread of a man surveying a battlefield where legends had been born. His weathered face reflected both pride in his Marines' achievement and sorrow for the terrible cost of their success. The unit reports stacked on his field desk told a story of courage that would echo through military history, but they also recorded a butcher's bill that had reduced proud battalions to company strength. The statistical summary of Marine casualties made sobering reading. Over 1,800 Marines killed, wounded, or missing during the 3-week battle. These numbers, stark in their clinical precision, could hardly convey the human cost of an engagement that had transformed boys from American farms and cities into battle-hardened veterans. Companies that had entered the wood with full strength now paraded fewer men than a peacetime platoon. Captain Clifton Cates, whose company had spearheaded the final assault, stood among the shattered German positions with the few Marines who had survived the entire battle. His men, faces aged beyond their years by experiences that would haunt their dreams for decades to come, displayed the quiet pride of soldiers who had accomplished the impossible. They had proven that American fighting men could match the best that European armies could field. The captured German positions revealed the extent of enemy preparation and the magnitude of the Marine achievement. Concrete bunkers, some with walls, 3 feet thick, had required direct hits from heavy artillery to neutralize. Interconnected trench systems, complete with overhead cover and communication trenches, demonstrated the sophistication of defenses that the Marines had overcome through sheer determination and tactical skill. Post-battle analyses conducted by military historians, as documented in the official records of the American Battle Monuments Commission, would establish Belleau Wood as a watershed moment in American military history. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Daly, whose battlefield leadership had inspired Marines throughout the engagement, supervised the collection of American dead for burial in a temporary cemetery established at the wood's edge. Each wrapped form represented not just a casualty statistic, but a young man whose sacrifice had contributed to the ultimate victory. The Marines who performed this grim duty worked with the reverence due to fallen comrades who had paid the ultimate price for their country. The German prisoners, those few who had survived the final assault, spoke with grudging respect about their American opponents. Oberst Heinrich von Schenk, captured during the final action, admitted to his interrogators that he had never faced troops who combined such tactical flexibility with absolute determination to complete their mission, regardless of casualties. His professional soldier's assessment would prove prophetic of American military capabilities throughout the remainder of the war. Private Thompson, one of the few men to survive the entire battle, sat cleaning his Lewis gun with the mechanical precision that had kept him alive through 3 weeks of hell. His hands, steady despite the horrors he had witnessed, performed the familiar ritual that connected him to the weapon that had been his companion through the darkest hours of combat. Around him, other survivors performed similar tasks, maintaining equipment that had proven its worth in the crucible of battle. The victory at Belleau Wood resonated far beyond the borders of the forest itself. News of the Marines' success reached American newspapers, where headlines proclaimed the emergence of a new breed of American fighting man. The nickname Devil Dogs, earned through their ferocious attacks against seemingly impossible odds, would become a badge of honor that Marines would carry into future conflicts around the globe. General John Pershing's official dispatch to Washington carried words that would become part of Marine Corps tradition. The deadliest weapon in the world is a Marine and his rifle. This simple statement, born from observation of Marine performance in the blood-soaked forest, captured the essence of what had been proven during 26 days of sustained combat. As evening shadows fell across Belleau Wood on June 26, 1918, the surviving Marines began the process of reorganization and resupply that would prepare them for future battles. They had written their names in the annals of military history through courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to victory. The forest that had tested them so severely would forever bear their name, renamed Bois de la Brigade de Marine by a grateful French government. The Battle of Belleau Wood had ended, but its legacy would endure as long as men remembered that freedom's price is eternal vigilance, and that some battles, regardless of cost, must be fought and won. The Marines who emerged from that hell-torn forest carried with them not just the satisfaction of victory, but the knowledge that they had proven themselves worthy heirs to the traditions of American military excellence that would guide their corps through the challenges of the 20th century and beyond.